Okay, today I'm going to be showing everyone how to make a good homemade Clash Royale deck. I like to think of myself as a relatively good Clash Royale player, and so I believe that makes me qualified to teach you how to make a deck, because I'm not bad at this game, I'm pretty good at this game, and I want to share the knowledge that I have, and it'll hopefully help you in your climb to Legendary Arena. So, first thing I want to talk about is spells. I like to use the Log and the Fireball, just because of how versatile they are. And the reason why you want to have a small spell, just a cheap spell, and a more expensive spell is because the more expensive spell will help you take out larger things and help you deal with buildings, right? And the small spell will help you deal with swarms. That makes your deck that makes it so your deck has things available to counter a wider range of cards. And so the next thing is, let's say I have P.E.K.K.A. in my deck. I'm using a P.E.K.K.A. Bridge Spam deck, like the Battle Ram, all the standard stuff, right? You got the Electro Wizard. I'm just using a normal Bridge Spam deck. Instead of the Log, because I'm using P.E.K.K.A., I'm going to use Zap, right? Because it synergizes better with the P.E.K.K.A. than the Log does, right? And so you want to have at least one small spell and one big spell. That's like the perfect range to have. If you have one spell, it can sometimes work, like one small spell or one big spell, but it's best to have two spells, and even there's some decks that work with three spells, like that Goblin Giant P.E.K.K.A. deck that's terrorizing the meta right now. But the sweet spot really is the Log and the Fireball. Or not the Log and the Fireball, two spells, small and big. And then the next thing I want to talk about is having a defensive building. Now, different defensive buildings are going to work good for different kinds of decks, different archetypes, which we'll talk about later. But I personally like to use the Evo Tesla because it's one of the best buildings right next to the Evo Cannon, right? So I love to use the Evo Tesla in pretty much any deck that I use a building in. Like this Mortar P.E.K.K.A. deck, it's really expensive, and I could make it cheaper by using the cannon, but I have the Evo Tesla, so I use that instead, and it actually works really well. But basically, with buildings, it's good to have at least one. It's not 100% necessary, but if you're losing and you don't have a defensive building in your deck, that might be why. If you're losing a lot and you don't have any defensive buildings in your deck, there's a good chance that that is the reason why. But some decks can work without defensive buildings. I'm not going to go too in-deep about defensive buildings and placement and stuff. I'll save that for another building or another video. But I'm just going to say, if you are losing, there's a good chance it's because you don't have a defensive building in your deck. The next thing I want to talk about is a win con. You want to have at least one, and you want it to synergize with your deck. Right? You want your deck to synergize. This is the deck this is the card that you're going to be building your deck around. So if I'm using Goblin Barrel, then for a Swarm card, I'm going to want to use the Goblin Gang instead of this, because the Skarmy, it's not as good as the Goblin Gang is. And the Goblin Gang, it's really good with the Goblin Barrel due to the fact that not only does it give you air defense, but it helps bait out spells like Log and Zap and Snowball, right? And so one thing that works really well as a secondary win con with the Goblin Barrel is the Skeleton Barrel, right? And so I like to have it Evo, because the Skeleton Barrel Evo is really good. And so the reason why this works so well is because of the fact that the Goblin Barrel, they're going to play a spell on that, for sure. If they have a spell, they're going to counter with a spell, right? Which means you can then go in with the Skeleton Barrel, and it's going to be a lot harder for them to defend it, especially if their building is out of rotation, or if they don't have one, right? Which is why you should keep a building in your deck. And so having one or two win cons, having two win cons is really helpful, because if they counter one, if they just have a perfect counter to your win con, having that second win con is going to make it immeasurably harder for them, because you're going to be able to get more value when they try to counter the Goblin Barrel. So if they've got two spells and they counter this with a log and this with fireball, and then I throw this at them, now they're going to have a much harder time, because that's one more card they need to have in their deck to counter you, right? So having 2 win cons makes it less likely that every single opponent you come across is going to have a counter for your deck, because they need more than 1 counter, because these things require 2 different counters. Because if it's like 400 damage for this skeleton barrel to drop on their towers, so now they need a building, because a spell's not going to work. It's not going to help, right, when it comes to the Evo, because the death damage is enough. And then they also need a spell for this, a spell for this. They can counter with a knight, but do you see what I'm getting at? Having 2 win cons makes it a lot harder for them to counter you. Now, having the support troop, the Goblin Gang, is great because it milks out those counters, right? It gets them to play their counters to the Goblin Barrel. On top of that, it gets great chip damage, and it's a great defensive card. Another thing I want to say is make sure at least one of your support troops is a swarm card, right? If you're playing an archetype like a cycle deck, make it skeletons. If it's a bait deck, make it Goblin Gang. If it's a control deck, use spear goblins, you know what I mean? And then that way your deck's going to have great synergy, right? But it just depends on what archetype you're really building around. And then another thing I want to talk about is air defense. You want to have at least 2 cards that can defend the air, right? So something like bats or spear goblins. Something that you can drop on a balloon and be confident that you can defend it, right? Because if somebody's running a deck with all air cards and you don't have any air defense, excuse me. If somebody's running a deck with air cards in it and you don't have any air defense, you're almost always going to take damage from that. Which is another reason why defensive buildings are so helpful, because they can also act as air defense cards. Even if they don't shoot the air cards, they'll still pull the cards. And so things like minions and archers are great ones. If you're using a bait deck, the princess is a great one. A lot of people like to just drop the princess at the bridge and forget about it. But you would be surprised how powerful the princess is on defense, especially against swarms, right? So make sure that you don't play your princess unless you are sure you're not going to need it on defense. Because if you don't have it and you need it, you're going to realize real quick how bad of a play it was to put it at the bridge. And then the last thing, one of your support troops needs to be a mini tank. Even if you don't have a tank in your deck or something, it needs to be a mini tank, especially with bait, because that mini tank can tank for your goblin barrel or your skeleton barrel, and on top of that, they're not going to be able to just log away your defense, because if I don't have a mini tank and I just throw like spear goblins in here, they're going to throw like Mega Knight at the bridge or something, and now I'm going to drop these 3 cards on it, and they're just going to log it. And then my defense just gets melted, and I lose my entire tower, right? If you only have swarm cards to defend with, you're screwed. I like the knight with the goblin barrel. Now this is a bait deck, right? It's not the same, it's not like a meta deck, right? It has good cards that are meta, which is okay. That doesn't mean it's a meta deck. But there's key differences here, like the fact that I'm not using Rocket and I'm not using Inferno Tower. And I don't remember what this card would be replaced with. I don't quite remember what this card would be replaced with. But usually Skeleton Barrel's not in this deck either, right? And so there's key differences between the meta and this deck, right? And sure, they're going to know that you're playing a log bait deck when you drop the Goblin Barrel, but that doesn't matter because the deck is genuinely good. I've got a log to deal with swarms, I've got a fireball to deal with bigger cards and air cards, I've got Tesla to deal with air cards, I've got Goblin Gang, those spear goblins in that gang, are going to help with air cards. This is going to help with swarms by doing that splash damage. I've got 2 win cons, so it's much harder for them to counter me. And I've got a mini tank, right? So I can throw that on defense. The knight alone can fully counter a Mega Knight. Can you believe that? That's how important it is to have each of these different things, right? And this right here is a bait deck, right? These cards are all bait cards. The Princess, the Gang, the Skeleton Barrel, the Goblin Barrel. These are all bait cards, right? And then, now another thing, the next thing I want to talk about is archetypes, right? You have control, things like Spear Goblins, where is it? The Miner, right? It's another good one. Mortar is a great control card. Tornado, right? Those are all control cards. Something like Miner, NATO, and I know this is a meta deck that I'm building right now, but it's just an example of what control would look like, right? Miner, NATO, Spear Gobs, Bomber, right? These are all cards that synergize really well with each other, and that's the reason why meta decks are so good, is because they all started off as homebrew decks, they all started off as homemade decks, right? And then they got to be meta decks when the meta favored them, right? And so the thing is about the meta we're in right now is it's very diverse. So a lot of meta decks are meta right now, right? But all of these started off as homemade decks. Any one of your homemade decks might be meta one day, you know what I mean? And so let's build a control deck, right? And then there's also Miner, Poison control, things like that, right? We're gonna go Miner, we're gonna go cards we know synergize with each other, right? Log is great for versatility. And then, again, we want Tornado instead of the Fireball. And the reason why is because we can deal with a lot of the same things with Fireball by just activating the King with our Tornado. And then, what's another thing we're going to want? Did I put Bombers in already? I did. Now, the next thing I want is I'm going to want a defensive building, right? A Cannon. Cannon's a great defensive building, right? And so, then I have 2 spells. They synergize with the deck. My 2 win cons, they synergize well. I've got some support, and this will get me a lot of chip damage on top of that. And then I'm going to want... I know Miner's a mini tank, but he's also my win con, so I don't want to spread anything too thin. And so then I'm going to put the Knight in so that I have a mini tank, so I can deal with bigger cards, like the Prince or the Mega Knight, right? And then the last card I'm going to want is another support card. Something that can do air. I want something that can deal with air cards. So I'm going to go with archers. And then I'm going to use Evo archers, right? So, look, this deck now, right, has really good synergy. And so, what I can do with this deck now is I can go into a game and I can have a counter for a very wide range of things, while also being able to deal out really good damage, because this deck has great synergy. And across any archetype, synergy is going to be the thing that makes your deck good. Because if I just throw a bunch of cards in willy-nilly, right, I just go over here and I just go Battle Ram, Skeletons, frickin' Snowball, Barb Barrel, Berserker, Knight, Mega Minion, just a bunch of random crap. Goblins. Just a bunch of random crap. This is the worst deck you've ever seen. This isn't going to win. This isn't winning any fights, because none of this really synergizes with each other. The Barb Barrel doesn't synergize with the Battle Ram. The Skeletons is just random cycle, which can be okay at times, but it doesn't really have a place in this deck because it's not a cycle deck. This deck doesn't even have an archetype. It's just a bunch of cards thrown into each slot, right? And so you don't want to do that. You want to be deliberate with the cards that you use. So this deck that we just built right here, I'm going to go in and I'm going to show you how powerful synergy can be for you. The synergy in this deck is going to be what wins the game, right? Tesla, that's going to then counter that Hog Rider. And then look at how that Earthquake then counters my Tesla, right? The synergy in both these decks are what makes the plays. Now I can activate King with my Knight. The Knight is just so versatile. That's why he's so good in the deck. I countered his card and activated my King. I'm going to play a Goblin Gang with him, and he's going to tank for that Goblin Gang. Now that he used his counter, I'm going to go with Goblin Barrel. Then I'm going to Fireball that, and I'm going to get some extra chip damage. And then since he countered with the Earthquake, I'm going to take a little bit of damage, and I'm going to have to play the Knight. But basically, the synergy in this deck is making it so I can hold my own against these cards, right? He just played another one of his counters. I can Goblin Barrel, and I still have time to get back to my Swarm card. And you want to be mindful of your placements as well when you're playing, obviously. But the main idea of it is that when you build a deck that has good synergy across your cards, you're going to have a much easier time winning. The amount of chip damage I can get really helps for when he's able to deal with my barrel. On top of that, he's playing things like that, giving me free Goblin Barrel damage, right? And sure, it's not a lot because of the E-Spirit, which is unfortunate, but then I can use the Fireball to deal with that Evo. That Evo just got 0 value. Look at that, I just countered all of that with just the Tesla and the Goblins. Now I can get much more chip damage with my Princess. Okay, never mind, she locked onto the wrong thing. And see how I can deal, I have an answer to all of these cards, right? I have something I can say about all of this, and I can deal with the cards that he's using. I don't know why it didn't hit it, that was weird. And even though I lost, right, he had a great deck to counter mine. If you look at the deck, right, I had an answer for a lot of his cards, and if I just play smart, I can do a lot with it. And so, all you really have to do is look at what cards, when you build your deck, look at what cards you're using, and what cards end up going unused frequently, and then change it around every once in a while when you need to. But for the most part, just leave the deck alone. Once it's good, just leave it alone. If it's broke, if it ain't broke, don't fix it, right? And so that way you can get used to the deck and learn how it works, right? Anyway, that's going to be all for today's video. Have a great day, everyone who watches this, and make sure you subscribe.